For those of you on WebEx, can you hear us?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can, Supervisor Mass.
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you, Supervisor Boots. Okay, we will proceed then to item number 4B, prioritization of the Administrator's 2022 work plan. You have in your packet the work plan. Again, there is a huge amount of items on that work plan. And I would request if you didn't get to prioritizing that, I would like to have at least everybody take a look at those, the work plan, and come back with your top 4 items that you feel, and have those discussions with your committees as far as what is your top priority based on your committee feedback. Because we've got to give, I understand everything on the work plan is important. There's no question. However, we also have to be practical in what we can expect to get done. So a prioritization of those items on the work plan is absolutely critical to give direction to our single employee, that being administration. And questions. I would throw it out to questions. Supervisor Langenhan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I was going to bring this up today. The ARC, as far as their priorities, don't have, I would be surprised if they could identify 4 out of that list. And I know that sounds weird, but the department has a lot of in-house work. Not that they don't coordinate with the administrator, but I don't know if they can say 4. So this leads to my next point, which is this really the best way to be prioritizing the work? Because I can already see standing committees coming back with 4 of their own priorities, and we're just having discussions amongst the executive committee with everybody having their own projects. So couldn't we just skip that part and have the discussion as an executive committee?
It's entirely up to you. You know, I would have thought that you'd want the feedback from each of the standing committees, but if you feel that the executive committee, as we did last time, it was the executive committee only is the ones that provided the prioritization. Supervisor Lang, go ahead.
And I'd certainly thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd certainly like to hear the perspectives, viewpoints of everybody else in the executive committee. I just struggle with the idea that we all have our own areas of work. And obviously, a lot of those work areas, you know, besides ERC's main roles, which I think if I looked at the list here, the number 1 priority is obviously the comprehensive plan update for us, because, you know, I think if you look as the group here, the comp plan affects every single one of these groups. That should rise to the top. You have other things like the class comm study for employees in every department. ARPA funding, I think that's going to be very sought after by every single one of our standing committees. So it's not that I don't want to see standing committee input. I just don't know how that adds value to this process and helping the administrator who only has a finite amount of time in prioritizing his work. So maybe this isn't even a discussion for this agenda item, but I think what I'm getting at is we have to do or perform a discussion in the future related to how we prioritize the work, because I don't think this is effective. Not the administrator isn't getting enough done, because you are, Lance, but I don't think this is effective.
Okay. Others? Other discussion? Supervisor Robinson.
So the process is to try to prioritize it, but the question that has to realistically be asked, I don't see many of the things on the list that won't be worked on. And so we can go through a ranking process, and if it doesn't create priorities in commitment of resources, we haven't done much. So the question is, given the expectations, there are some things that we may not prioritize but need to be done. You know, if there are things relative to the ERP system and others. Which items in there, from an organizational perspective, are critical to our work in the next year? I think we probably should break those out. And then we should look at where our priorities are beyond that, where those optional items.
Okay, just a second. Supervisor Longhorn?
And to Supervisor Robinson's credit, the only one that really has a true finger on the pulse of what's truly important to the organization is that man right there.
Why don't you want to?
That's very kind of you to say. This is Administrator Leonard. I don't disagree with anything that's been said. The biggest challenge in the last 2 years that I've experienced, well, I shouldn't say the biggest challenge, the last 2 years have been challenging in a great many respects, but there's a great deal of work, and to borrow some language that was just used, there's a finite amount of time, and I need to know, what do you really care about? There are operational things within here that, quite honestly, if you don't prioritize them, we still need to do them. Our facilities work, finishing the work at the North Central Healthcare renovation and renovating our Lakeview campus to move our departments, that needs to happen. And I'm going to devote a lot of my time, and a lot of other staff are going to devote even more time to that project, even though perhaps if it didn't get updated, the West Side Master Plan, absent the board telling us to abandon it, you've already given direction to do it. You know, there are things on the list that, quite honestly, if committees have asked to look to pursue, but we could stop them, I could stop them tomorrow. Working with the library board to identify an appropriate use of the third floor. I don't need to spend time doing that unless it comes up in the context of something else, unless you tell me you want me to do that. The Regional Forensic Science Center with the task force, that work is ongoing. We should get some very important information, hopefully in the very near future, that will ultimately bring the decision to this board whether or not it wants to spend a significant amount of money to undertake an entirely new form of delivering forensic services in our community. I can't imagine that a lot of my time would not be spent, to your Supervisor Longenhahn's point, on ARPA. He is 100% accurate. Departments are submitting program requests. I have no doubt we're going to get program or project requests from outside of our organization. The deployment of those funds is going to take a lot of time and energy. The Workday implementation, that is
Critical.
very critical, and it is a very, very significant amount of staff resources. So I think, to all of your points, yes, there are things that, quite honestly, we need to deliver on. My ask is, as your employee, please, to the extent you can, identify the projects that really are not true priorities, that you're not looking for me to accomplish. That doesn't mean I won't. If they fit in and I have
If the opportunity.
resources I can allocate, I will try to get them done, because all of these things these are not my discussion items, they are yours from your various committees. I appreciate all of your service. You have a great many good ideas, and they come up frequently. ERC, for example, recently brought up hey, how are we going to utilize the funds that have been collected through the solid waste department in excess of $600,000, and they're restricted use funds by statute. We'll be able to put together a memo with some uses relatively easily, but you have a lot of those things creep up during the year that weren't on the work plan before. So whatever insight you can provide on things that, hey, really, this is no longer important, would be greatly appreciated. I'm not sure if that's helpful, Mr. Chair, but there are a lot of things that, to each of your points thus far, there's a lot of work on here, and that doesn't factor in, some of your committees have put together plans of work throughout the year as well that are likewise very, very ambitious and take a great deal of time, that aren't necessarily on this document.
And there's other, and there's other things that come up throughout the year that in some cases just end up taking priority. The prime example is the issue that was in a press release today in the city. And how does that impact the facilities and the operations the county has in the city of Wausau? Supervisor Longhorn, go ahead.
Sure, and good points all around. I appreciate them. I just get back to the original point, which was the standing committee discussions and identifying what the priorities are, that concerns me, because each of our standing committees, the way that most of them work is that they sit in their own little silos and they specialize in their own bodies of work. So if we want to have a discussion about what the highest priorities are for the county as a whole, and all the standing committees are going to recommend their projects to take back to this committee, I just don't know if there's value in having those discussions at the standing committee level to get back up to exec. That's great if they're engaged, I want my standing committee to have input. I don't like this process. And maybe what I'm trying to say is that I would like to see improvement in this process, and I don't mind putting it on the agenda for an ERC meeting, so.
Supervisor Leahy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In listening to this discussion, I almost wonder if we're doing this backwards, if it would make more sense for administration to come up with the ranking and then we approve that, or we make changes as we see fit with a list that's kind of already in place to get us going. On the other hand, I wonder if instead of looking at this as a very linear ranking system, 1 through whatever, do we look at it as more of like a green light, yellow light, red light situation where we can put 10 things in green, absolutely do those first in whatever order within green. Yellow is less important. When you're done with green, you move on to yellow. Maybe there's some things we can make red that is simply, this body doesn't see as a priority this year, but if you get through with those yellows, you go on to red. I guess I kind of struggle when we talk about these ranking things because there's just so many things. It feels like you're never going to get to the 30th thing, and that kind of just adds to the uselessness of these ranks that we've seen with other systems, other processes, and within other committees.
Yeah, I'm not going to tell the ERC to become an expert in every single one of these. There's no way. There's not enough time.
Vice Chair McEwen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As far as the committees, I do think it's important that you engage your committees. I think we're a committee board, and we stress that over and over and over, yet we don't want to get, comments or feedbacks from your committee members. I don't have my iPad, but I do remember some of them, and a lot of the priorities, I don't know why I was attracted to the criminal justice ones, but I was. That doesn't mean that I would have ranked those over something else. I do, looked at the whole, the 3 pages of the administrator's work plan. But like I said, I think we're selling the rest of the board members short by not including them in the discussion. And I don't disagree with Supervisor Longhorn that it's going to be their list of priorities is probably going to deal with their committees, but that can be up to the chair of that committee to make them aware that it's not just what our priorities are, or our concerns at our committee. So like I said, I do think that the rest of the board should be engaged in those priorities because they may have different ideas than we do. So, like I said, either way, like I said, and some of these work plan ideas can be taken care of in a couple of months. Some can be ongoing for years. So you have to understand that. And like I said, it's just, like I said, I think it should be looked at by the whole board and, move forward from there. So, thank you.
Well, the main reason why I think that still needs to provide some level of guidance and ranking is simply this, is I do understand that some things will just continue. Because they're in motion already, and so they will just continue. However, I also see on the list certain things that at some point have are at a stopping point at this point. In other words, they haven't moved any further in the last year, and we are going to, the next item on the agenda is to evaluate the administrator based on his work plan. So if we don't give him guidance, one could argue that, oh, look, he didn't get anything done on this item on his work plan, and therefore I'm going to, evaluate him poorly. And I don't think that serves our administrator well, nor does it serve our constituents. That's the only reason I think that we need some kind of prioritization.
Supervisor May.
Okay, go ahead, Supervisor Mask.
This question is directed more to the administrator. So Lance, when you listed these things, A, B, C, D, E, I'm kind of looking at that as did you prioritize these in your mind when you were listing them?
I probably did so unconsciously, but the organization is different, and I did it that way intentionally because, as Supervisor Leahy said, when I listed them previously, and I looked through all the last, I think it was 4 or 5 years of administration work plan, and it struck me that a linear listing wasn't overly helpful because, when you get up to number 20, it's like, does that mean that number 20 is not important? I didn't necessarily see that correlation. So what I did this year is I really tried to group things together based on kind of subject area. So you'll see facilities-related projects. You see, I listed the Forensic Science Center by itself, but then you have finance-related projects. You have criminal justice initiatives, as Supervisor McEwen referenced, HR-related projects, intergovernmental partner work, and miscellaneous projects. And probably within there, quite honestly, I'm sure I did that unconsciously based on my recollection of the items. What I can do, and if there's consensus, I certainly can do this. As Supervisor Leahy referenced, I can identify what projects are, in my mind, things we can't stop without the board giving very clear direction and me doing some investigation as to the ancillary consequences of stopping them. Things such as our facilities work, things such as the workday implementation, the master plan, the West Side master plan. I can go through and essentially put those in a bucket of, and I tried to do that with identifying ongoing versus new. But I can perhaps take another review at that and identify those things that, in my mind, I don't want to say cannot be stopped, but are sufficiently important that they shouldn't be stopped without a lot of inquiry and consideration. And then identify those things that, even if we've started them, can be relatively easily stopped. If that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think so. Cause well, I was looking at, the first 3 pages and item F, acquire property for multi-department highway parks facility. So I'm thinking that wasn't, when I was looking at this, I was thinking that maybe this wasn't as high of a priority right now as, and same thing with developing policy, uh, the next one, G, the policy and process relative to the divestment of county-owned facilities and properties. So it's hard for me to look at this, and I've been looking at this for a couple of days. I even printed it because I couldn't do it on my iPad, and it's hard for me to decide what is a priority, because what I think is a priority, I know, is different with you, because you're dealing with this stuff every day.
Supervisor Leahy and then Supervisor Longenon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd kind of like to argue as well that the very fact that these items are on this list means that the standing committees have had their say about what their priorities are. So when we talk about making this more streamlined or efficient or just getting on with the ranking part of it, I'm not sure that we really need to backtrack to the standing committees, because essentially this came from those committees. This is the representative body of those standing committees. It feels like it's well within this committee's jurisdiction to just do the ranking if that's what the administrator is asking of us. And I also don't mean to put more work on the administrator by suggesting that maybe he starts the process. But like Supervisor Mask just said, you're the one working in this more intensely than we are. So if it would be more helpful for you to just get that direction from us in a different way, we're happy to do that.
Supervisor Longenon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and this will be my final comments. Let's face it, we're an unreasonable board. I just counted the directives. Maybe I'm off. I did go to Marathon High School, so I don't know if my numbers is so good, but it's like 42 directives to one person, right? So I understand that this has to be a system that prioritizes the county board prioritizing oversight over its employee, the administrator. I totally understand that. I just think that this process could be a lot better than going to the standing committees, getting some information we know is already going to be there, that their projects are going to rise to the top. We come here, we get information from administration, and we go, oh yeah, that might not be so that might not be a high priority, right? So I don't mind taking it to the standing committees. We can do that, but in the future, let's have a process, a discussion on process. I think there's a lot of value in what Supervisor Leahy suggested with the administrator giving us more information so that we can make better decisions. Because guess what? The first thing I'm going to do if we have to take this to the standing committees is give them that information. It's the very first thing I'm going to do. So, all right, I'm done. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Well, I mean, if you look at, the overwhelming majority of them also say ongoing. If you just go through them, and so, I mean, they're projects in some cases that have started, and they're in some part of the process. Others, as I think Supervisor Mass pointed out, the acquisition of land for a multi-department for infrastructure has, hit at some point, not a roadblock, but we're waiting on another part of the process, that being the West Side Master Plan redo. We've gotten direction from infrastructure that they don't believe that the infrastructure and highway facilities would be on that current location. But at the same token, we're still waiting on the West Side Master Plan getting completed before we start looking and locating additional property to potentially acquire. So a long way of saying that, if we if we actually just want the executive committee to provide the feedback, I am fine with that also. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What I have heard, and then perhaps consensus is too strong a word, but I can certainly go through and, to your point, Mr. Chair, the example of acquiring property for a joint department is a good example of an ongoing project that has slowed. We were making a lot of progress, quite honestly, in 2019. We were very close to purchasing property, and then that has not occurred. And the insight that I gain from the discussions is, you know, if you don't want me to push that, I won't. So I can, and I haven't been to this point. I mean, we've been kind of patiently waiting on the sidelines. Certainly, Commissioner Griesbach and I do have periodic contact with Jim, more so than I, but have periodic contact with the potential landowner through a third party on occasion. But that is a good example of a project that, until you tell me it's a priority, I don't need to push and allocate time. And certainly the vast majority of these projects are not, in fact, all of them are not things that I accomplish. It's a whole lot of other people that do the work, and I just make sure, if you tell me it's important, I'm gonna make sure that pressure is applied when it needs to be, and accountabilities are applied, and reporting is done. But I can go through and highlight things that I think can kind of go in that second bucket of not a priority until you tell me it's a priority.
Supervisor Robinson.
Well, you know, I'm looking at a few of these, and there's some dependencies in there. And some of those dependencies are in the new ERP system. So it makes sense, like the dashboards, and some of the budgeting issues. Let's get the focus ought to be, get the new system in place, get the good data that allows us to make it. So are there some things that we can move and delay and just take off the table pending ERP completion to relieve some of that pressure? So you can say, no, the board has said that this process benefits from that information that we currently don't have. So I think there's 3-4 items in there we can peel out.
Yep.
And we ought to look for those that have those dependencies. And if we have that critical infrastructure in the works, let's wait for that to advance it. So I think you can pull out a few and delay. So, you know, the dashboards are one, and there's a couple of others in there. And
Absolutely. Okay.
Supervisor Booth.
Supervisor Boots, go ahead.
I just wanted to say one quick thing. I guess it's always good to look at different, better ways to approach these things. And I guess the one nice thing we could do with doing this at executive is, if we sit down with the 42 some items, and as the chair of that committee, you know your priorities for that committee for the work plan, we can discuss, well, this is why we thought ours were the highest ranking, and this is why we think they should be on the work plan. And then maybe somebody from another committee where we weren't there can say, yeah, I understand that's a priority, but here's why ours is a priority and why it shouldn't trump yours. This is why it should trump yours, because there's certain things we need to do and this and that. Those conversations, I think, need to happen, and maybe there's a gap. So maybe this is a good time to relook at some of this stuff, like the way we're doing it. So it's a good way to change things, I guess. Just want my input.
Thank you. Okay, we will, I think we will have the administrator provide a little bit of work. Also, I would like each of you to review this and come back as homework for our March meeting to look at it and have those discussions. I guess I've been convinced that I don't know that we need to have the input from the additional committees, because I think most of these, well, all of these have come from committees at some point. So, all right, back to, go ahead, Vice Chair McKeon, go ahead.
Thank you. I guess I'm the only one that feels it would be beneficial to go back to your standing committees, but I understand in what Supervisor Booth said. It just, to me, like I said, I just think you need to keep the board informed. A lot of things have changed since this work plan and the previous ones. A lot of them are followed up. So there might be some changes from committee members, but you won't know that unless you would talk to them. But I just want to point that out. Thank you.
Yeah, I totally appreciate that. The one thing I would suggest is, after we've had the discussion, then we can go back and explain to each of the standing committees, here's why the discussion happened at exec, where all of the committee chairs had the discussion, and these are the things that rose to the highest priority based on the total overall, rather than the siloed approach like Supervisor Longhorn was pointing out. Okay. All right, we are down to item number C, annual evaluation of the county administrator. And if somebody wishes to read the Supervisor Longhorn, go ahead.
Yeah, I like hearing myself talk. All right, Mr. Chair, I'll make a motion to go into closed session pursuant to Wisconsin Statute 19.85 sub 1 sub C. To consider performance evaluation data of a public employee over which the governmental body has jurisdiction or exercises responsibility, namely the county administrator.
Is there a second? Second by Supervisor Robinson. Any discussion? Ask clerk to call the roll, please.
Gibbs,
Aye.
McEwen. Aye. Boots,
Aye.
Budke,
Aye.
Guild, Byfrick, Longenhan.
Aye.
Leahy, Mask,
Aye.
Robinson.
Okay, we will be in closed session again, and I would ask the public service, or the video to be turned off. And also, we will be moving everyone again to the lobby and bringing you back when we return from closed session.